Good morning, everybody. Sam, are we at 9:30?
Yes.
Okay, so let's thank God for the gift of learning Torah together, and then we'll get right into our material. Baruch atah Adonai Eloheinu melech haolam, asher bachar banu mikol ha'amim v'natan lanu et Torato. Baruch atah Adonai noten haTorah. So this coming Thursday is a big deal for a few reasons. First, of course, it is Joan Mayall's birthday. A happy birthday, Joni, January 6th. We love you, Joni, and a happy birthday.
Happy birthday.
Happy birthday, Joni. It is also the birthday of my son, Sam, who turns 31, January 6th. And it is also, of course, the first anniversary of January 6th. And the question that I wanted to surface with you, and I really appreciate being able to do it in this group, and I'll share with you why that is it's January 6th, and how are we supposed to think about that momentous event a year later? And I'm very grateful for this intimate class. Because it gives us the space and the time and the bandwidth to reflect on this important public issue of January 6th and what it means to our country now, and how it intersects with Jewish wisdom and the teachings of the Torah, etc. Just by way of example of how much I appreciate this class, I received an email from a colleague who you might have heard of, Sharon Brous. She's the rabbi at ECAR in Los Angeles. And in today's Omicron world and the ongoing pandemic, everything is global and everything is a click away. And Sharon Brous is doing a whole national, global click away evening on reflecting on January 6th, a year later. And somebody sent it to me and said, should Temple Emmanuel join? And my instinct was stay far away from this. And I'll tell you why, because last year on Veterans Day, I sent out an email on Kristallnacht about shattered glass and how it portends greater destruction. And it was the one time in my rabbinate that I did not listen to my wife. She said, don't send that email, it's a mistake. I said, how can I not send this email? This election denialism is going to kill our country and kill our democracy. I have to send this email. Shira said, you're going to rue the day that you send this email. I said, I have to send this email. It's just like burning within me. And, I sent it to my colleagues, Michelle and Elias and Eliza and Dan. Michelle and Eliza and I have a deal. Every time we ever give a sermon, we share the sermon in draft with each other. And you know how many times I've written a sermon and they've said on the first draft, oh, I love it, it's perfect. Answer, 0, never. It always takes me 4 drafts to get a sermon done. And I sent this draft out and we worked on it together, and we sent this out to the congregation, reflecting the best moral wisdom of the 5 of us. And most of the people who agreed hardly even saw it. And the people who disagreed were so mad that I spent the next 2 months meeting with them one at a time. And many of them talked about leaving the shul because they didn't feel comfortable at Temple Emmanuel, if that's the way I felt. And so in the end, I talked to Shira about it, and she said that that was her objection, is it won't actually move the dial. You'll write about election denialism is going to kill our democracy. The people who already agree. The people who don't agree won't agree. And all you'll do is piss people off and cause estrangement in the synagogue. So now a year later, I get this email from And by the way, some of the people who were offended, I reached out to them in Elul to say, I'm sorry about the misunderstanding and it was a hard season. And there were people who would not make peace all these months later, even with Rosh Hashanah and Yom Kippur, would not make peace. So now come back to yesterday. I get this email from Sharon Brous saying they're going to do a 1-year Yortzeit on January 6th. And what should we do? So, and I thought stay far away because who needs more of this? It hasn't changed. It's only calcified. It's only gotten harder. To 2/3 of our country, that was the beginning of the end of our democracy. To 1/3 of our country, it's Patriots Day. It's 1776. So what do you do with that? So Michelle agrees with me, stay far away. So we're not going to do that, but I really appreciate this class because there's enough, even we don't agree, however many people are on the call, gets 45 people on the call, there's 45 points of view. But it's a space where there's trust and affection so that we can have a conversation on things that matter in ways that I cannot with the whole congregation. So here is the question that I want to surface, acknowledging that, and it's not, we're not talking about politics per se, it's how to think about what January 6th means for the country that we all live in and that we all share and that we all love. What does it mean for us a year later? And what I want to bring to you is, as a lens on this question, is an interview that David Brooks had on December 14th with Leon Kass on the Ezra Klein show. Ezra Klein is, a very thoughtful guy, and he's on paternity leave, so he's had some guest hosts. And David Brooks interviewed his philosophy professor at the University of Chicago when Brooks was in college. He had Leon Kass as a professor, and now, all these years later, he's interviewing Leon Kass. Leon Kass has written a lot of books. His most recent book is Founding God's Nation, Reading Exodus. It's long, it's over 700 pages. And the question that Brooks asked Leon Kass is, what light does the book of Exodus shed on our nation now? And we'll look at it inside in a minute. Samantha's going to be kind enough to share the screen. But here's his basic point, which is the premise of Brooks's question is that the children of Israel in this week's portion with plagues 8, 9, and 10 are going to finally be sprung after 430 years. They finally get out of Egypt in this week's portion, 430 years. And who gets out of Egypt? Very divided tribes. Very different, very divided, very fractious, very contentious tribes, okay? And yet they have to become one people. And the Brooks-Kass interview assumes that the premise of the book of Exodus is, how do you take 12 fractious, contentious, divided, diverse, different tribes, and out of that mess, form one nation? That's the question of the book of Exodus. And here's what Leon Kass has to say. And again, we'll look at it inside, but he says you need 3 things. You need a common story that all 12 tribes can subscribe to. You need a common higher purpose that all 12 tribes say, it's not about me, it's not about my pleasure, it's not about my getting and spending. It's about a higher purpose, and we all share this higher purpose. And it's about common rituals that bind us. And in the language of Exodus, the common story is the Exodus is Shalach Ami V'Ya'avduni, is the Exodus is Shalach, let my people go so that they may serve me. that the reason that there was an Exodus was that we could not serve Pharaoh anymore, but we could serve God. That's the common story. And the 12 tribes might be different. They might not even like each other, but they all share the common story that we were all tribes. Maybe we fought then, we fought now, but we were all tribes. We all got out so that we could serve God. Then there's the common higher purpose, which is standing at Sinai. And then there's the common ritual, which is the Mishkan, the tabernacle, all those sacrifices, plus the Jewish calendar. So here's the obvious question. In America, do we have a common story? Do we have a common higher purpose? Do we have common rituals that bind us all despite our differences? And if we do, fabulous. The book of Exodus suggests that we can take a fractious, contentious group of tribes and make a one nation out of it. But if we don't, then what happens? Where are we? Okay, that's the trajectory of our class. So what I want to do, and what we're going to do for each of these, is I'm going to show you, we'll read the David Brooks piece. Then I'm going to ask Samantha to share the text from the Torah, from the book of Exodus. And then on each case, we'll discuss, does our nation have this quality in common? Okay, so that's our plan. My friend Samantha Price, can you please screen share page 1 of the David Brooks piece, okay? So, and you all got this yesterday as well, and I'm just going to read a little bit of it, okay? So I'm on paragraph the second paragraph. So when I think of Exodus, David Brooks says, I think of it as Moses or God forming a fractious band into a people, into a nation. And I realize they're not necessarily the same things. And it seems so relevant now that in America, at least, we are a fractious band of rival tribes. How do you think of Exodus through the prism of our contemporary politics? Leon Cass. Well, Exodus is the book which takes the Israelites from the sons of one man, Jacob, to a nation of 600,000 men, not counting women and children. And it tells the story in 3 stages. First, their abject slavery and misery in Egypt, their miraculous deliverance and their sustenance in the desert. Second, the story about their entering into a covenant with their God at Sinai and his giving them the law, which governs all aspects of their life. And finally, the building of the tabernacle, a place where they will worship their creator and deliver and have an opportunity to be in contact with him in their midst. These 3 parts of the story have, I think, not just historical, but philosophical significance. They suggest that these particular parts of the formation of the people of Israel might, in fact, be relevant pillars for any stably founded regime. Consider, first of all, through their story of their enslavement and deliverance, they have a national story. On the night of Exodus, before they go out, they're commanded that every year at this time, in perpetuity, the fathers should tell the children the story of the going out of Egypt. That's the national narrative. Second, they have a given law and morality given to them at Sinai. And the question is, does not this kind of law serve to not only hold them together, but guide their very lives? And then finally, in the tabernacle, they have an opportunity to have an answer to their aspiration to remain in touch with what is highest. That they're not going to simply be satisfied with safety and comfort and getting and spending, but they want to be somehow in touch with what is highest in the world. And the question is whether to come down to the present day, can there be a stable and enduring and well-governed nation that lacks a shared national story, that lacks an accepted law and morals, and that doesn't aspire to something higher than its own comfort and safety? Can a people who have instead a dedication to technological progress, to economic prosperity, and the private pursuit of happiness. Is that sufficient to make a people remain a people? If our national story is contested or even despised, if our morals are weakened, if the national fabric is frayed, and if we've abandoned any kind of a sense of national dedication, can we endure? So it seems to me that the things one learns from people formation in the case of the ancient Israelites holds up a mirror to any particular polity aiming to endure, and holds up a particularly challenging mirror for America in the present time. So Sam, if you can get back to the full screen. Thank you, Samantha, for that. So before we're gonna double click on these three different elements of common, the common story, the common higher purpose, and the common ritual. But first, I would love to elicit some general comments about this approach to our question about how does Exodus intersect with our country? How does the Torah intersect with this moment of the week of January 6th? And I'd love to hear any thoughts, comments, or questions. My friend Dottie, it looks like your hand is up. I would love to hear yours, so please unmute yourself and would love to hear your voice.
It is a sad situation, it's true, but there's one basic element between this, I think, and the Exodus. We were formed as a democracy, and we are a democracy. If there are people who disagree with our thoughts, in other words, black is black and white is white, they're entitled, that's part of our Constitution, they're entitled to express themselves, not in the way that they did. They're hurting our democracy. But my basic feeling is that we are a democracy. Moses and the people coming out of Egypt after 400 years, whatever, they had no freedom. They had no freedom of speech. They had no freedom of worship. They did not have what we basically have had, quote, from 1776 or whatever. That's my feeling. And if we abuse what's given to us, that is a problem. But we are known, I just read an article to the fact we are supposedly the greatest democracy in the world. Now, that's the basic, that's my premise. I feel that in itself gives us the power to try to overcome those who don't agree with us, but we have no right. Everybody has freedom of speech.
Okay, Dottie, thank you. I wanna just step back for a second and ask you if you like this lens that Leon Cass and David Brooks bring of Exodus. Do you think it's asking the right questions about our nation now? Do we have a common story? Do you think that matters? Do we have a common higher purpose? Do you think that matters? Do we have common rituals that bind? Do you think that matters? Do you think this lens is a helpful and accurate lens or not? Does anyone have a problem with this lens? Louise Wolf, would love to hear your voice. Thank you.
I think something that has dropped out of this discussion is that both Judaism and the foundations of American constitutional structure placed an emphasis on individual freedom, and that does not necessarily have to be equated only with acquiring material goods. You can have a dedication to contributing to the society as a whole, which is based on your own individual freedom to develop in a way that permits that. And I feel that the vocabulary of this discussion places a great emphasis on the collective and loses part of the vision of both Judaism and America, which stressed individual choice and individual freedom.
Okay, Louise, thank you. That's such a helpful contribution. And I think we need to double click here because there's some serious nuance on the Jewish end. Samantha, I'm going to ask you now to screen share page 2 of the David Brooks article for 1 second. And then I'm going to ask you to screen share the first of the Torah passages on page 362. And we need both to deal with Louisa's a very helpful contribution that both American democracy and the Torah texts emphasize individual freedom. So I wanted to double click on that point. We're now on the David Brooks screen share, page 2. Thank you, Samantha. Great. Okay, so page 2 is right. Okay, page 2. Look at the next to last paragraph, right before it says, and when Tocqueville comes to America, okay? And this is directly relevant to Louise's point. I'll just a little bit of context, and then we'll get to that paragraph. The Exodus story was certainly, and for some of the pilgrims, some of the original American colonists, and certainly some of the founders, a story in the light of which they saw themselves, and it both made sense, and it also didn't quite make sense. Usually Exodus is treated as a story of national liberation, and it certainly is that, and the liberation of the independence from Great Britain. One could treat King George as a certain kind of pharaoh, not quite so terrible. But the word freedom, and most people don't notice this, the word freedom or liberty doesn't occur in the Exodus story at all. I want to just read that again because this is such an important difference. The word freedom, and most people don't notice this, the word freedom or liberty doesn't occur in the Exodus story at all. Their deliverance from servitude to Pharaoh in order that they might serve God on his holy mountain, it's a replacement of servility and oppression with service, which is a kind of service which is edifying and elevating. Okay, and now, Sam, would you please turn to page 362 for a second, which is the first Torah text that I had given.
Can you see that? Or
Samantha, you got it? Page in the Torah text, that's the second set of texts.
okay.
If you can do the page 362, which is the first text from the Torah texts.
Mhm.
Thank you, Samantha. Okay. And then now, if you look at, this is in response to a major misunderstanding about the biblical story, which Cass references. We mostly think that Moses said, let my people go. Let my people go. Okay. But the truth is, Moses never says, let my people go. Never says, let my people go. Only says, let my people go that they may worship me. So if you look on verse 16, thus says the Lord, let my people go that they may worship me. And if you look at it in Hebrew, Ko amar Adonai, thus says the Lord, Shalach ami v'ya'avduni. Let my people go that they may serve me. And if you look, by the way, at the word v'ya'avduni, this is Shai Held's point that you can't read Torah too slowly. If you look at the word v'ya'avduni, okay, it's very pregnant. You know, everyone on this call knows the line in the Haggadah, Avadim hayinu lafaro b'Mitzrayim. You can remember that song. Avadim hayinu lafaro b'Mitzrayim. Avadim hayinu. Right. The word for slaves is avadim, and the root of slavery is ayin vet dalid. And here is God telling Moses, Shalach ami. Let the people, let my people go via avduni, so that they'll be my slaves. They'll be God's slaves. They're going to serve God, not Pharaoh. So it's not freedom so that you can be what you want and do what you want and buy what you want and have as many guns as you want and live your freedom and not wear a mask and cough all over other people. It's not that. It's you're going to be free so that you can serve God. Okay. And now what I wanted, so the story of, but I think now we can come back to the class, full screen. I think, Louise, your comment is so very helpful because it points to a very big difference and nuance in our common stories. The common Jewish story is not freedom. The common Jewish story is freedom from Pharaoh so that we can serve Hashem. Right? Every morning, Shachris, every afternoon, Mincha, every evening, Mariv, and 100 brachot during the day. Right? But the common American story, at least as it comes down to us, is freedom, freedom, freedom. And then you think about the Wild West and the settling of the land and manifest destiny and all that stuff. And so it's about leave me alone, or with the angry edge of America today, leave me the F alone, get out of my effing face, leave me the F alone, let me be free. I don't want your masks. I don't want your vaccinations. I don't want, leave me the F alone, I'm free. And even, it's shocking that even now, what percent of our country will not get vaccinated? Because leave me the F alone, I am free. So I think there is a very, and with anger, and everybody, we've all read the articles about the anger epidemic. So I think I want to just point that out, and Louise, I want to come back to you and then open up for more conversation about the difference between the common American story, which is taken to be about freedom, and the common Jewish story, which is taken to be about service to Hashem. Louise, what are your thoughts?
My thoughts are that the American nation can't be equated with a divinity, and the trend in American society towards collectivism and away from individual rights assumes the greater wisdom of the mass of the country as a whole, and cuts down on freedom to think, debate, develop new ideas, find ways of helping the whole society that are against the current orthodoxy. So I don't think the Jewish mandate to serve God can be equated with any trends in the current society. I think that the constitutional, that there's been a real sea change in what's acceptable to expect in terms of individual freedom to judge situations and make decisions, and that you can't just draw a simple parallel with anything about a stress on service within Judaism.
Okay, thank you, Louise. Judy Swartz, what are your thoughts about, common story, and do we share a common story as a nation? And Judy, if you can please unmute.
I think I'm a little confused. I thought you were asking us, I guess, as American Jews, do we have a common story? And how does that relate to what Exodus is talking about? And with the 12, very mixed up tribes. And I was thinking initially, not so much as an American, but as an American Jew, do we have, hopefully, within our mixed tribes of different denominations, this unifying, but we are all Jews, that we respect one another, no matter when we're going to get into ritual is going to be different than in American Jews within the denominations. And I thought you were asking, how do we relate with our brethren in Israel? Do we have this common story and a common purpose? And I certainly hope we do. I realize it's a big problem for a lot of people, because if ritual and Shabbat observance, which is so basic to more conservative Orthodox people isn't observed as it is, you know, in more liberal people, then we're a little bit, we're not as together as I'd like to think we were.
Right. So it's interesting. I mean, here's a meta question that I would circulate for the whole conversation, which is, does the lens of common story, common higher purpose, and common ritual, if Cass is right, and if his 700-page book is right, does that make one optimistic or less than optimistic about the creation of one nation in America? And it feels like there's some tensions and ambiguities here. By the way, I think another tension that kind of grows out of the conversation that Louise and I were having is, and Alana Stein-Hain, the scholar at Hartman, did a whole class on this, so I credit her with this insight, that Americans tend to talk about rights. It's my right. It's my right not to wear a mask. It's my right to not get a vaccine. It's my right to treat my body the way I want to treat my body, and I don't want to wear a mask on my face, and I don't want my body to have an arm, and I don't, my. It's about rights. And Alana has pointed out that in Judaism, the emphasis is much more on responsibilities, right? There's an American emphasis on rights. There's a Jewish emphasis on responsibilities, which is maybe wearing a mask is a pain in the neck. And maybe I don't want to get a vaccine, but what's your responsibility to others? And that is a tension, that's intention. So before we leave the idea of common story, I wanted to just see if there's any other comments about common story and this lens and whether it's helpful or not. Elise Friedman, would love your thoughts. And then Steve.
I was going to say that I don't think that we as Jews have a common story any more than we as Americans have a common story. I think we do have a shared background. We have the Torah and we have our mishpatim, etc. And we have among us a few shreds that everybody recognizes. For example, they say that the Seder is one thing that almost every Jew does some sort of Seder every year. And it doesn't seem to me to be that much more than everybody getting excited about the 4th of July. So I don't see his thesis carrying through.
So Elise, let's take the Jewish piece of that side of the equation. I mean, one cannot gainsay that not all Jews subscribe to the story. And there are plenty of Jews who are remote from the story or indifferent to the story, don't care about the story. But for Jews who care about our Jewish story, is there not a Jewish story that God gave us this ancestral homeland? We got expelled from this ancestral homeland in the year 70. We had 2,000 years of misery, persecution, oppression, and pogroms. Read People Love Dead Jews. And then because of Zionism, we reconstituted our national homeland, and now we have a homeland of our own. And simultaneously, for the first time in our history, we have a diaspora community that, while not perfect, is at least theoretically committed to our freedom to live as Jews, which is just not the European graveyard. So that we have the story of oppression, marginalization, persecution, leading to now Israel and leading to the American Jewish experience. That's our story. Is that not now? Some of us might do mincha, some of us might miss mincha, some of us might do Shabbos, some of us might miss Shabbos. But our common theme is our common story. Is that? Is it not?
It is, of course, and for Americans, there's, this idea of freedom and rights, as you mentioned, and
Right.
but we all, even if I think, but I mean, I'm the grandchild of immigrants, but and for me, still the story of coming from a place that was not good, where there were possibilities,
Right.
is still a real story. So.
Okay. Thank you. Steve, I'm going to take one last comment from you and then John, and then we're going to move to common higher purpose.
Okay. Yeah, thanks, Wes. First of all, Wes, welcome back. Hope you had a good time with your
Thank you.
family. And nice to see everybody here. 2 shout outs. Thank you, Yael, for inviting me. I don't usually get to come to the class. And so nice to see you, Joni Mail. I miss seeing you, and it's fabulous to see you up and about. So what a nice start to the year. To go back to the Alana Stein-Hain, very much there, the way she talks about the difference between American rights, which I recall her saying gets us in trouble, versus obligations, that we have with a very nice balance of obligations to ourselves and obligations to others. So I would certainly encourage people to try to find that talk, one of the best talks I heard last year. I think Cass sets it up very nicely with the idea of common story, the higher purpose, and the daily rituals. What was very helpful to me was talking to my son, David, who's a union organizer in Virginia, and talking about what's going on in the country. And he pointed out to me, look, Dad, the country was never founded as a place for everybody, right? It was for a very small group of white landowners of a particular religious group. And now that we're seeing a lot of the fractious, because different people are claiming their share, sometimes in ways that I think are abhorrent, but they're claiming their share and their destiny from a country which never had it for everyone. What other thought? I can't help but think the Exodus story, it was just so dramatic. When everybody was released from Egypt, they weren't in Egypt as slaves anymore. When they stood at Sinai, I mean, at least as we read it, what a miraculous series of events. And also those events were relatively recent. We're now talking about our country, which is several hundred years old, which on the one hand is new for an old group of people like the Jewish people, but it's a long time ago for Americans with short history. So I think it was just that's where I wondered if the analogy of Exodus to today will be able to hold up.
Thank you, Steve. Thank you. By the way, it's incontrovertible that when all people are created equal was written, they meant Christian, white, landowning males. They didn't mean blacks. They didn't mean slaves. They didn't mean women. They didn't mean Jews. They meant Christian, white, landowning males. And in one sense, the story of our nation has been trying to move from that original interpretation to include all God's children who are American citizens. And that comes with a lot of, well, with all the drama of American history that we are all familiar with. But that's the drama, the story of moving from Christian white men own this country to we all own this country. That's the drama of our story. John, last comment on this common story element. You done? Okay. So then the second thing that that Brooks and Cass talk about is common higher purpose. And I wanna go back to the Cass article. And Samantha, if you can screen share page 3 of it. Because I thought this is in the Tocqueville issue, I'm sorry. I want to read the following thing from Leon Cass. The balance between those things of obligation and liberty is way out of whack. It's been getting out of whack increasingly in my lifetime, especially beginning in the 60s. And certainly in the present climate, when one hears the talk about racial injustice, nobody is repairing literally to the brotherhood of man under the fatherhood of God, or to the principles of declaration, all men are created equal, both of which are of biblical origin. So there is a way of saying that our reliance on the biblical teachings of our common humanity and the biblical moral teachings that would produce people who have the kind of virtues we talked about at the beginning of the conversation, there's a way of thinking this is very much threatened and in retreat. And then if you go down to the Leon Cass paragraph, it says, I think, let's see, this is Leon Cass. The idea of radical human equality is a gift to the world of the Hebrew Bible to begin with. I mean, the existing codes in the neighborhood made, there were differences if you harmed a noble, or if you harmed a free person, or you harmed a slave. Whereas the covenant that's made at Sinai is made with every Israelite, second person, singular, equal. And the idea of everybody equally in God's image, that's the foundation of the teaching of the equal dignity of every human being. And similarly, the teachings about justice and truth-telling and care for the weakest among us, that's of biblical origin, and it's here. Okay, so, and then I'll just go down one last paragraph. And while the general ideas are loose and still inform various political movements, the question is whether, I'll just read it. The question is whether other areas, for example, a second. And while the general ideas are loose and still inform various political movements, the question is whether the self-command and the self-restraint and the self-elevation is still present in the culture. Okay, so and now we can go back to the full screen, Samantha, thank you. So Brooks is saying that the higher purpose of Sinai is that everybody is in covenant with God. And this covenant is about radical equality, that everybody is created in the image of God. So we're all covenanted at the Holy Mountain. And as Cass points out, both in Exodus and later in Deuteronomy, it's every person is there, every person counts, and that radical equality is part of the higher purpose, to see dignity in every person. So my question to you is, does our nation have a common higher purpose? And if so, what is it? And if not, if we don't have a common higher purpose, then Houston, we've got a problem. More than Houston, we've got a problem. America, we've got a problem. So what is our common higher purpose? It can't just be we want to buy stuff. What's our common higher purpose? Debbie Ginsburg.
Okay, so if you want to put the president as our God and law and order, you know, following the Constitution and obeying the law. In 2016, like millions of others, I was in shock when Donald Trump was elected. But we accepted it, and we figured we'd have 4 years to withstand his presidency. 4 years later, Joe Biden was elected and, you know, becomes the Lord of our country. And of course, I was elated. However, the Trump supporters could not accept that the way that I had done 4 years ago. They took the law into their own hands. They beat up police. who they say they are in support of. And some of the police were in support of that insurrection, unfortunately. So it's a very difficult, pivotal time in the history of our country. Very disturbing.
Yeah, so Debbie, and not, your remarks suggest that a common purpose in our country is lacking. And I'm sure you've all read the articles, of which there's so many, that to this day, something like a third of our country supports the insurrection. It's not an insurrection. It's 1776. It's Patriots' Day. So I guess my question to you, and that's just, you've all read those articles. It's just out there. To this day, elected representatives and senators won't critique what happened as an insurrection. It wasn't anything. It was tourism. It was, well, you're making a mountain out of a molehill, all this thing. And those are elected representatives to this day. So my question to you is, that's just obvious. That's just the fact. My question is, how do we form one nation out of that? Any takers on that? If we don't have a common purpose, our purpose is to grow from all people are created equal, is just white Christian landowning males, to all God's children. If that's not our purpose, that binds us all together, we have differences about how to do it and the pace at which we do it, et cetera, but that's the common trajectory we all share. But if that's not the common trajectory we all share, if there is no common trajectory we all share, if there is no common higher purpose, then how do we form one nation out of that? Anybody want to offer your wisdom? Bruce Donoff.
Bruce, you were unmuted.
Oh, respect
Hmm.
and acts of integrity
Okay,
for each other.
so respect and acts of integrity. Could you say more, Bruce? In other words, let's say, how do you, we all have pictures in our mind of what happened on January 6th. The people who were wearing, paint and horns and Nazi regalia and all this kind of thing, the Confederate flag, the noose, etc. How does the images of that violence intersect with respect?
It's a lack of respect. It's doing only what they believe in, and they find people of their own ilk to build upon that, and it gets enabled by certain leaders. It takes a certain leader to enable that behavior and lack of respect. And
So that's the work we need to do to change the trajectory, to recover and reclaim that respect. Okay. So you can see that we have some challenges with common story. We certainly have some challenges with common higher purpose. I've got two comments, one from Alan Zathermary and one from Lillian. And then I want to take a look at this last piece, which is rituals. Alan Zathermary. And if you can unmute, please, Alan.
Okay. One of the biggest things that we're missing, and this is the saddest part, where is truth? Where does truth come from? We're in a society that we don't know what is true and what is not true. And the lack of truth causes all these problems, and that is the biggest problem I feel we have.
Alan, I think that is so true. What you talked about, the lack of a unifying truth, is what all these things have in common. I mean, in the Torah, we know it's true because God gave it to Moses, who gave it to the people at Sinai. And Jewish tradition itself venerates the notion of truth, Chotamo shel HaKadosh Baruch Hu emet hi, that the signature of God is truth itself, that we should be thinking about truth. In our world, we know, especially with social media, there is no one shared truth. There's Fox News truth and CNN truth. There's Wall Street Journal truth and Washington Post truth. And so truth depends on what news source you get your information from. Very few Americans, read Fox, watch Fox and CNN and come to their own conclusions. Very few Americans read the Wall Street Journal and, the Washington Post and the New York Times and come to their own conclusions. So truth is echo chamber truth, and that only reinforces how do you form a common bond out of that. Richard Gray.
Hi, I guess I tend to think one way is to frame the question as states of war. And I think the world is always at war to some extent. We have war in Israel, we have war all the time. And I think we are at a state of war in the United States. And I think that peace is to some extent it's a level of war where people don't actively kill each other. And I think that the right wing is at war, and they've declared war very clearly. And I don't think that the rest of America has realized it's at war, and it needs to be at war and strength in order to have peace, which is a unstable situation, but something to be fought for.
So, Richard, thank you for that. I think you have kind of put in explicit language something that I feel and sense from this conversation, which is, I'm not hearing any grounds of optimism. I'm not hearing anyone say, oh, of course we have common this, of course we have common that. And you're talking about a sustained war, low-grade war, peace through strength, etc., kind of puts a very clear exclamation mark on that. I wanna come to the end of the Cass article and then talk a little bit about rituals, and then talk about, is there any hope in this story? So Samantha, if you could please screen share the final page of the David Brooks, Leon Cass piece. Okay, so I'm starting on the third full paragraph. So we sort of, this is David Brooks talking. So we sort of overdone it on individualism. And we've seen the loss of social capital, the loss of community, the loss of friendship, things I do not understand, but are going on in the country. The rising number of people who say they have no close friends. Over half the country saying no one knows me well. The number of people who have ruptures in the nuclear families. Just a breakdown in connection across a wide array of social indicators. So that to me is a sociological problem that led to a formative problem. In other words, this is the old, Robert Putnam bowling alone thing. And bowling alone was tame. That meant that you were still in the bowling alley, you were just bowling alone. And now, a generation later, bowling alone has meant doomsday scrolling alone, has meant I get my news alone, has meant I'm on my own little echo chamber getting news, and I'm by myself and I'm angry and et cetera, and I'm with other angry people alone in this cyber world. And that's on all sides of the political equation. So you have a sociological problem that leads to a formative problem. How do we have a country out of that? So then Brooks asks, do you have any hope that we can recreate community, recreate institutions that we have faith in, that we're willing to submit to in order to be formed by them? How deep is the despair here? Can I just honor that question? How deep is the despair here? Then Cass. One doesn't want to sound like a grumpy old man by saying everything has gone to hell and it was much better in the old days. It's a temptation of people my age. but sometimes the evidence is strong. And one has to be very, very worried at the present time if one cares about a robust, unified national society and culture. We're living in an acutely angry time. And in the short run, I don't know how that can be turned around. But the way back has to be really to return to some of the sources, not as finally authoritative for us and solve our present problems, but they are our intellectual, cultural, and moral inheritance. And so it seems to me the task is largely a matter of education. It's a question of partly not tearing down the country and looking only at its faults and its warts, but remembering and not taking for granted the extraordinary blessings that one has living here, including the freedom to tear down and belittle the institutions that give us that right. Okay, so Cass basically says, yeah, there's a lot of anger and the level of despair is deep, but you get in that last line a kernel, I think, of a response that could be more hopeful. So I want to say on the anniversary of January 6th, it feels to me that there are two moves. One move is one that most of us gravitate to naturally. I certainly literally live in this move, which is that the big national challenges, lack of a common story. Oh, Samantha, you can now put the full screen on, by the way. Thank you, please. That the lack of a national story and the lack of a common higher purpose and the lack of common rituals that would bind us all lead us to go local. That where life is lived out is not in the national world, but in our local world. We live in 02458, we live in 02459, we live in Newton, we live in the Berkshires, we live in whatever particular hamlet we live in. And that's really our country. Our city is our country. Our home is our country. Our shul is our country. Our shul is our universe. And, you know, that's the humble response. And that, I think, is what most of us actually do day after day. We're citizens of this great but flawed democracy, but where we actually live out is our lives, is we live out our lives in our zip code. And that's what we contribute to. And that's the most that we can control. And we look at the large national stories and throw up our hands and say, what can I do? That's one move that I think we do. But the second move, I want to offer a glimmer at the national level that comes from Leon Cass's last paragraph that we read. And I'll tell you a story about this. And this is not a particular, I don't have a program, I don't have a 3-point plan. I have a mindset for you. My son-in-law, Davide Russo, was born in southern Italy. And he's been living in America and working in America for 10 years. On a green card. And next week, he takes his citizenship test and then would get a passport and would become an American citizen. And, we spent the last 10 days together, and I've been quizzing him on all the questions that he'll have to face to become a US citizen. And here's what's amazing about my son-in-law. Not only that he loves America, but he believes in America in a way that many of us might have once believed in America, but have lost it. So, for example, he believes in he believes in the American dream. I don't know anybody who uses that language anymore, the American dream. The American dream feels like very 1950s. Very 1950s, the American dream. Who talks that way anymore? All the energy is about what's wrong. None of the energy is about what's right. But my son-in-law says, back where he is from in a small town in southern Italy, there's no trajectory of growth. And all of his high school friends, he's 32, are still living at home with their parents. And they were born where they're born, they'll live their lives within a few miles, and they'll die and be buried within 3 miles of where they were born, and there's no trajectory. And by contrast, in America, there still is a trajectory. Not for everybody, but for some, and for him, there's a trajectory. Second thing, we are all focused on what's wrong with our country. And you pick the noun, whether it's anti-Semitism and or racial injustice and or political toxic polarization, all that's a problem, obviously. What he sees is deeply the American ideal because, as a gay man in Italy, he was and is unsafe there. And he says that in Italy, to this day, gay people are beat up regularly and publicly. And that there is no hate crime law in Italy. It's not a crime to beat up gay people because they're gay. That if he and my son were walking down the street in Italy today in 2022, somebody could and might and would beat them up with impunity because it's okay to beat up gay people because there's no hate crime law against that. And America, for all of its problems, actually has hate crime legislation where it's not okay to do that. So he sees the American dream and he sees American ideals and idealism. And that makes me wonder, which is, other than Israel, is there any other country I would rather live in than America for all of our problems? There's no other country I'd rather live in, despite all of our problems. So here's what I learned from him and that I want to leave you with on the anniversary of January 6th. We've got a lot wrong with our country, and our conversation laid this bare. But don't forget this. What's wrong with our country should not blind us to what's also right with our country. The undone work and the unfinished work and the real problems are real. But that shouldn't blind us to what's right with our country. And I think in general, that's a good lesson that I have learned from my son-in-law. What's wrong should not co-opt all the energy. What's wrong should not steal all the oxygen. What's wrong should not make us unable to see what's also right. There's also a lot right with our country. And other than Eretz Yisrael, there is no other place I would rather live. So on January 6th, I pray that all of us will have the strength to do our part, to do both the local response, which is strengthening your zip code, whatever that means to you, and also the larger national response. Build on what's already good to make our imperfect land even better. Thank you so much, guys, for this class, and we'll see you next Tuesday. Thank you.